if I was willing to put this much work into a scam, I could make millions.
That sounds like a Hollywood movie.
Literally hundreds and hundreds of victims. It wasn't really about the money. It was about something else.
It goes back to 2018. At the time I was working as a features writer at the Hollywood Reporter. And at the time I covered almost exclusively what I like to call the kind of sleazy or dark underbelly of Hollywood. So, anything that had to do with crime or cons or, frauds or murder or just all the sort of weird, kind of unseemly stuff that happens in Hollywood. That was kind of my beat. It sort of became my beat. And it was just a lot of weird stories, strange tales. And so one day, a colleague of mine came over to my desk and she gave me a tip. She said that a contact of hers, a big Hollywood producer, was being impersonated. And she said, maybe you should look into it. And at the time I thought, well, okay, but I didn't really think much of it. It was, I heard a lot of stuff like that, a lot about just random cons or weird little grifts and things like that. So anyway, I looked into it. I talked to the folks at the producer's company. They said, yeah, there's something going on, but we're not sure what. There was somebody or a group of people, some entity was impersonating these famous Hollywood producers, all women. And these are not names that, your average Joe would have heard of, but in certain circles, they were huge, hugely influential, very powerful people. So for instance, folks like Kathleen Kennedy, who produced, E.T., for instance. Amy Pascal was another. She produced some really big movies. There were a number of these very high-powered women who were being impersonated. Well, not only were they being impersonated, but whoever was impersonating them was contacting up and coming professionals in the entertainment industry and selling them on the idea of some sort of work project for which it was required that they then travel to Indonesia. And so these up and coming artists, a lot of photographers, actors, screenwriters, people who were sort of in the business of entertainment were being contacted supposedly by these famous women and being told that they needed to go to Indonesia on these fake work projects. So right away, it immediately took on these very strange overtones because I thought, well, this is just completely bizarre. Like, why? Who would do this? Why? Why Indonesia? What's the point? Where's the money? Like, how does it all fit together? What's going on? It didn't really make much sense. And of course, as a journalist, when it doesn't make much sense, you get more interested. So I was pretty curious at this point. Then I spoke to one of the victims, this young guy. He was a photographer, and I got on the phone with him, and he unspooled this story for me. We spoke for like 2 hours, and he just told me this absolutely unbelievable story about how he had gone to Indonesia thinking he was working for Amy Pascal. He had blown through $50,000 or $60,000. It was the entirety of his life savings, money that he had earmarked for medical care for his child. So he'd lost all his money, but which was bad enough. But what really struck me in my conversation with this guy was how sort of damaged he was. I mean, this guy was really messed up by this experience. He had spent weeks and weeks, many weeks. I mean, I think it might have even been a few months in this kind of relationship with Amy Pascal, this woman, thinking that he was on this fantastic work project with Amy Pascal. He'd gone all over Indonesia. He'd taken flights and buses and cars. I mean, he'd gone everywhere. He'd done all these things. And the whole time he'd been in this ongoing conversation with the woman he thought was Amy Pascal, and she turned out to be this incredibly abusive, manipulative, volatile, contemptuous woman. And she had kind of strung him along for weeks and weeks, taken all his money, put him in these impossible situations, and really just engineered and orchestrated this crazy psychological, mind game on him. And so when I spoke to him, he had just emerged from this, and he was wrecked. I mean, he was just a total mess. He'd lost all his money, as I said, but he'd also kind of lost his self-confidence. His whole sort of work life was messed up. His family life was a mess. So it had just torn his life apart. And I remember I got off that call, and I just thought, okay, well, this is, there's something going on here that is different than what I at the time understood to be, your average scam, because there was so much work that had gone into this, huge amounts of labor on the part of the scammers to pull this off. And what I would subsequently learn is that the amount of money he lost was the exception rather than the rule. That is to say, there were hundreds and hundreds of these victims who went to Indonesia, and the vast, vast majority of them lost relatively little money, on the order of a few
Right.
thousand, a few $1,000s, really not all that much. This guy happened to lose a lot,
How did
but yeah.
I'm sorry. How did he lose so much? Because I know that watching the scam, there was so little money derived, as far as, profit for the scam. Like, I mean, most of the money these people are spending is on hotels and cars and traveling and, buses and trains and, whatever, airfare. Like the money that the con artist is getting
Mm-hmm.
was actually like, 1,000, 1,500. I mean, it's costing these people tens of thousands of dollars, like cost them $10,000, but the actual money that the con artist made was $1,500, $1,800. Like,
Yeah.
it's like, and it was so much work,
Yeah.
because I was watching it with my wife, and I was like, if I was willing to put this much work into a scam, I could make millions.
Yeah.
Like, what is this person doing? Why are they doing this? Like, it didn't make sense.
Yeah. I mean, it is.
It was disturbing.
Yeah, it is. And this is kind of the question that sort of animated me from the beginning, which was, and I think everybody who comes into contact with this scam sooner or later gets to this question, which is, well, what in the hell was going on? I mean, why did this person do this? What was the end game? And we can certainly talk about that. I think, I will say that there were enough people that lost enough money, not just to the airlines and the hotels and stuff, but to the actual scammer,
Okay.
that it made
Did I
it.
miss that?
Well, a lot, not all of that appears in the doc. I mean, a lot of that I do talk about in my book. But so there were a few very key victims who lost quite a bit of money, which I think enabled him in part to keep going. I mean, he had other sources of revenue and stuff, but yeah, I mean, to your point, he wasn't getting rich off this. This was not the scam that you hear about, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, where the person gets away and goes off and buys a villa in Hawaii and lives happily ever after. This was basically a labor of love, in a sense. It was a constant effort to keep this thing going, because it required the involvement of many, many people across many continents. It required a constant effort to get more people sucked in, to keep them going. And when people cottoned on and bowed out, it required getting new blood, new victims in, and then just keeping them going, stringing them along required a lot of work, because he was constantly on the phone with these people. I mean, he would, like this guy that I mentioned, I talked to. I mean, the Amy Pascal that he knew called him multiple times a day, kept him on the phone for 15, 20 minutes, half an hour sometimes, just sort of haranguing and, harassing and sort of drumming home the importance of the work and stuff. So it was sort of a 24/7 operation, which brings us to your question, your central question, which is, well, why? I mean, why in the world would someone do this for such a little payoff? And the conclusion that I came to is that there was a payoff, but it wasn't really a financial payoff. The payoff was to be found elsewhere. So what's elsewhere in this case? And what I sort of landed on is that there is a kind of complex psychological game that he was orchestrating that satisfied some deep need within him, uh, you know, and that took this very malignant, malevolent, manifestation. It was a desire to control, a desire to manipulate. There was a very sadistic element to this. This was somebody who found pleasure in in the act, I think, of creating these elaborate scenarios, placing people in these impossible situations and getting them to do his bidding. And I'm not a psychologist, and I hesitate to make any kind of definitive diagnoses, but I think just describing the behavior gives you a sense of where the pleasure centers for this person lay. And they really didn't lay, as far as I can tell, in the kind of the financial reward, but rather in the interpersonal mechanics, the weird psychological gamesmanship that was required of him, and that he forced on other people. And whatever that particular sort of sadistic bent that he had was, this particular scam satisfied that itch. And I think that's why he put so much work into it and was so willing to expend the kinds of energy that I think most people would, just say, well, screw it, it's not worth it.
Yeah, I wrote a book called Bailout, and it was about a guy named Marcus Schrenker
Mhm.
who had run a few different scams, but he was a pathological liar. Like, I mean, like a very, I don't want to say a good pathological liar, because he wasn't exception. The problem with pathological liars is that they'll lie about little tiny silly things that you figure out it was a lie. And they it's very quickly revealed that that's not true. You pick up a phone, or you bump into the person the next day, or
Mhm.
for whatever reason. But he would tell these ridiculous lies, and it was to make himself feel better, and he got a kick out of fooling people. Well, this is just pathological liars in general.
Mhm.
They derive extreme enjoyment out of fooling someone,
Mhm.
and it makes them feel better to fool people, and that you feel that this person is important. He constantly, and this is the thing about the guy.
Mhm.
He was married to a beautiful woman. He was a pilot. He had 3 beautiful children. He lived in a multi-million-dollar house. He had a successful hedge fund.
Mhm.
He drove nice vehicles, plenty of money. He's a top tier individual,
Yeah.
and he's still lying. He lies about working for NASA. He lies about being a fighter pilot. Like, none of these things are true.
Mhm.
You were never in the military. You were never a fighter pilot.
Mhm.
You never worked for NASA. But it was a constant thing. It's like, you're already somebody that people look up to. So, the whole, so, and then when I was watching it, and I was the documentary, I was thinking, like, he had to get some kind of sick, you know, pleasure out of, endorphin rush, or whatever you call it, like, by fooling these people, or and like you said, by controlling them, or allowing, it almost seems like a different kind of, like, a pathology, because I don't think because there just wasn't enough money in it.
Yeah.
In my opinion. But then again, I don't know, like, the person with the $50,000, I'm not sure how that individual ended up getting the money, because initially, like, the little fees that they had
Yeah.
him pay along the way, got to pay $1,000 for this, 600 for this, 5. So I could see that. And maybe being in, is it Indonesia?
Mhm.
Maybe that's a lot of money there. Like, you know,
Yeah.
I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
I'm thinking, is this a lot of money? And he's doing this to over 100 and some odd people,
Oh,
right?
more than
He's
that.
been going on for
It's
a
like
long
hundreds of
time.
people. Yeah. 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 And I think, I mean, your descriptions of the pathological liar that you wrote about and encountered overlap very neatly on a lot of the behavior that I saw with this individual. Just lying about random, easily disprovable things that just made no sense at all. I mean, it was almost, there were a few instances that I learned about where the lying was, I mean, it was so reckless and so almost whimsical, like it was just completely unmoored from any sense of reality. I mean, you could disprove it in a second. And yeah, I think there was a very strong propensity to do that because yeah, it afforded a certain amount of pleasure. I think what you said about fooling people is key. I spoke to a number of experts on psychopathy and various other pathologies, just to get my head around what I might be dealing with this person. And so I learned quite a bit about these different personality disorders, and in the process of reporting the book and the documentary. And one of the themes that came up was this issue of kind of fooling people, getting one over on other people, and the pleasure that can be derived from going through with these really elaborate ruses, and then sort of stepping back and seeing how people stumble and fall and trip over themselves in these traps that you've made. And that was really interesting to learn
Yeah,
about.
I was going to say it's funny because I read several studies, and there aren't a lot on pathological liars. And I read a book. I read two books. One of the books, it was called "Lies, Lies, Lies: The Psychology of Deception."
Okay.
Um, and it was, and it's funny because it referenced some of the studies that I then read.
Mm.
And they're not long; they're 12 pages, 14 pages. But yeah, I read it, and you're reading it, and you're like, and it would divvy up the different types of pathological liars,
Mm.
and it was super interesting. And then it's so funny because once you've read that material and you're having these interactions with this person, you're like, okay,
Right. Right.
like that makes sense. Like I can kind of understand that. Like I don't know why you said that,
Hmm.
but it just it doesn't even have to be for a benefit. That's what really killed for somebody who, for myself, who clearly doesn't have an issue lying, but there needs to be a benefit.
Hmm.
Like I don't just walk around lying and saying that I won, in 2002 I was a quarterback and won the Super Bowl. Like that's
Right.
like I'm not going to say it. Like there needs to be a benefit. Like
Right.
that's the kind of ridiculous stuff that he would say,
Yeah.
and you'd go, okay, well, I know that's not true.
Right.
Like, and I could easily find that out. Like, why would you even say that?
Yeah.
It makes no sense. It's not, there's no benefit other than you feeling good right now because maybe you're trying to one up me, or like, it just didn't make
Yeah.
sense. Like I couldn't even, but you could see it. It was so clear. And
Yeah.
the fact that this guy was willing to do it, it was the same thing with, I forget what is the name of the person that eventually got,
I mean, he had lots of different names, obviously,
oh,
but
oh,
he's most commonly known as Harvey, so we can call him Harvey for the purposes of the show. Yeah.
yeah, I don't, and I know he was trying to, but anyway, let's keep going. Cause look, for all of his, horrible traits, like he was an interesting guy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that's the
Mhm.
nicest way to put it. It's like there's no downtime with this guy. I mean,
Yeah.
he's living a very interesting life. I mean,
Yeah.
he's a character. I'm not going to let him. I'm not going to lend him money.
Hmm.
I don't want him. I'm not gonna. I don't want to introduce him to anybody as a buddy or a friend. But I could see having conversations with him as being interesting.
Oh,
You know.
I mean, without a doubt, that was also something that just kept me going with the story for the first couple of years anyway, was just this this sense that okay, I was dealing with somebody who was a very complicated person with a lot of sides and a lot of complexity, And there was a lot to unpack, and I wanted to understand that. And then ultimately, I mean, I don't know how much you want to give away for your viewers, but I mean, I will say ultimately, I did confront this individual and had a series of conversations that went on and on and on. And
Sorry,
yeah,
can I interrupt? Like, how did that happen? Like, at what point when you did you start writing articles first? Like, how did you decide, hey, I'm going to go all in on this? Like,
yeah.
I mean, let's face it, it could have just been an article.
Yeah, it could have been. Well, yeah, I suppose it could have been, and for some people it was, but for a variety of reasons, I just felt compelled to keep going with it, and ultimately to try to find this person. So just to kind of walk you through the chronology a little bit, or sort of how it developed after the summer of 28. So the summer of 2018, I got this tip, and I wrote a story. It was a cover story for the Hollywood Reporter, and it was called hunting the con queen of Hollywood. And it was just about this weird scam, and it was about this investigator who was trying to kind of crack the case. At that point, she had not solved it, but she was hot on the pursuit of this person, or at the time she thought it was a group of people. And so the story was just sort of like, there's this crazy scam, who is the con queen of Hollywood, what's going on here. Here are the voices of all these people who've been affected. Here's the investigator. We actually got some recordings that had been grabbed of the scammer in action, and we embedded those in the article so people could hear the voice work. And it was very elaborate and weird, and nobody knew, was it a man, was it a woman, was it multiple people, was it a criminal enterprise? So there were all these questions. The story went viral, kind of, and it just became a thing. And so I kept working on it, and I started getting more reporting, and I learned eventually, who it was, and I started talking to more victims. But we didn't know. I didn't know, really much more than that. Like I had a sense of who it was, but I didn't know the real name. I didn't know much about the backstory of the person. We didn't really know where he was from day to day, because in addition, weirdly, to doing this scam, this person also had a side gig as a food influencer in London, which was a completely different and sort of just a very weird thing to be doing while you're running this very elaborate scam in Hollywood. So that added a new wrinkle to the whole story, and I thought, well, that's definitely worth some time trying to figure that out. So the months go by, time goes by, and ultimately I decided, well, I want to try to write a book about this guy. So I sold the book idea in 2020, early 2020, and I started writing. I started doing the reporting and working on the book, and then of course, COVID hit, and that kind of changed everything, because I couldn't really go anywhere, or it was at least very hard to go anywhere. There was no vaccine. It was just kind of a crazy time, as you remember. And so I was working on the book, and then Chris Smith, the documentary filmmaker, got in touch, and he'd heard about the story, and he'd heard about that I was writing a book, and he said, maybe we should work on something together. And so he and I kind of paired up, and that was in the summer of 2020. And very shortly after he and I paired up, I made the decision that I was going to go looking for this person, this scammer. And that was a kind of a pivotal moment. It changed everything, because it meant I had to kind of venture out into the world in COVID. I got on a plane, and I flew to England, which is where I believed he was. But I didn't know where exactly. I knew I had a pretty good idea that he was in the city of Manchester, but I didn't know really. I had an idea of where he might be, like what building he might be in, but I didn't know for sure. Um, I'd never spoken to him. I'd reached out many, many times to talk to him. He'd never responded. So I just was taking a gamble. I thought I'm just going to go try to find this guy and get him to talk to me. So I flew to Manchester.
Yeah. Hey, real quick, just wanted to let you guys know that we're looking for guests for the podcast. If you think you'd be a good guest, or you know somebody, do me a favor. You can fill out the form. The link is in our description box, or you can just email me directly. Email is in the description box. So back to the video. Yeah, I was going to say the way you tracked him down was what you had someone that did the global positioning where they studied all the like. I have no idea how that works, but did you ever see the documentary Don't Fuck with Cats?
Yeah, it was great.
That was what it made me think of. I was like, how like who has this software? Like, how does this happen?
Well, it's funny. It might seem sophisticated, but it was well, I'll tell you the story. So what happened was, okay, I told you he's a food influencer, right? So one of the things he did was he had like 50,000 followers on Instagram, and I think most of them were just bought or purchased or whatever. But he had this whole persona on Instagram, which was, he'd get on there and he'd say, "Hey, Instagram folks," that was his thing. "Hey, Instagram folks," and he'd say, "Today I'm in, fill in the blank," and he'd hopscotch all over the UK. So he'd be in London, then he'd be in Edinburgh, then he'd be in Leeds, then he'd be in whatever, pick your city, Bristol, whatever, and he was just all over the United Kingdom. And so you just never knew where he was. And sometimes he would do a video and then he wouldn't post it for a week or two, and by that point he would have moved on to some other city and stuff, and he never gave anybody any insight into where he lived or anything. So it was just this roving food influencer. That's who he was. His handle was Pure Bites, and it was just this roving food influencer who was tasting the greatest dishes from Edinburgh to London and everywhere in between, and bringing his delightful treats to you, the viewer. And so the thing was, though, that when COVID happened, of course, it kind of curtailed people's movements. They couldn't really go maybe as far or as wide as they normally would. So one day in that summer, he, for some reason, it's still a bit unclear why, but for some reason, he decided to do an Instagram interview with this old classmate of his from his childhood, who was sort of interested in his life. So he gets on the Instagram live thing and he starts talking to her, and he starts telling her about his life and his difficulties, and it's half truths, half lies. He's just full of it. She later told me she thought he was just full of shit. But anyway, at one point, so he's sitting there, right? He's got the camera on him, and in the background you see this city, all these buildings and everything, and it's a bit hard to tell. There's no definitive landmark. It's just a bunch of it's an urban landscape.
Could have been anywhere.
Could have been anywhere, right?
There was really only one building that was semi-recognizable, but I'll bet you the similar buildings are all over the place in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, it was
like it could have been anywhere. I was like,
yeah, exactly. It was like just an anonymous city, nothing particularly.
Yeah, London Bridge. Bridge was it?
Right. Like if he'd had the tour, the Eiffel Tower, London Bridge, or something, then
right.
Okay. But in this case, yeah, it was just an ordinary, buildings. So he does this interview, and then in the course of the interview, he says to his interlocutor, he says, "And then here I am in the great city of London, which I love, and I'm living my best life," and so forth. So anyway, so the interview ends. This is in like, I don't know, August, or I can't remember when, sometime in the summer of 2020. So I think to myself, well, that's interesting. So it's COVID. He has identified himself as being in London, and it was clear that he was like living in this wherever he was doing the interview from. This was his, at least for now, sort of a home or a temporary home or somewhere where he was right now. And I thought, okay, well, maybe this is my shot, because all the previous interviews he'd been like in the street or in some restaurant or whatever. But here he was in somewhere that looked like maybe he was living there. He said it was London. Okay. So I took a bunch of I recorded the video, and then later I took a bunch of screenshots, and I contacted a friend of mine who was in the UK, and I said, look, I need some help here. Let's figure this out. I don't know where this is. It could be anywhere. What do you think? Do you think, can he's from the UK, maybe he knows something. So he spends a little time on it, and in this very sort of serendipitous turn of events, he gets back to me and he says, I think I know where he is. And what had happened is he'd looked at all these screenshots I sent him, and he was from Manchester, this guy. And in one little corner of one of the screenshots, he saw this kind of little tiny bit of almost like a little mini city park, not even a big park, but just like a patch of grass, basically, where there was a bench and there was, some buildings that were positioned in relation to the bench, then this patch of grass. And he said, I recognize that. I recognize that spot. And I said, what do you, what do you mean you recognize it? He said, yeah. He said, I worked across the street in that building for like 8 years when I was younger. And the trick was that because this guy, the scammer, was filming himself with a camera, everything was inverted, everything was reversed. So it wasn't immediately clear what was what, but this guy spent some time with the images and he realized exactly where it was in the city. And then he pulled up a Google Maps image of the city and positioned it in such a way that it would mirror the perspective that you saw in the screenshots that I had taken. And just doing a bunch of, kind of reverse engineering of these images. And then I sent him more images and we sort of worked on it together, figured out that exactly where this was, like literally what street, what corner, what buildings. And we switched the images around and figured out that, exactly where it was. And not only where the image was, but where possibly zooming back where it was taken from. And that's how we deduced that he was most likely staying in one of, 2 or 3 buildings that were like 2 blocks away. And one of those buildings, it turned out, when we did some more research, was this it's kind of like, they call them in Europe, they call them apart hotels. They're sort of like half apartment, half hotel. They're these residences that are available for people who are kind of on the move, or a business traveler who needs a place to stay for a week or a month or 2 weeks or whatever. They're kind of like they're furnished, nice apartments. So they're a step up from just a hotel room, and you get your own kitchen and your own entrance, and there's a concierge service. And so it's sort of like having your own little mini apartment for a certain amount of time. And that was perfect, right? Because this guy was always on the move. And so an apart hotel, no strings attached, no leases, nothing like that. You come, you stay for 2 weeks or a week or a month or whatever. You go, and also in COVID, it's great, right? Because you can kind of hunker down, you can shelter in place, you can get your food, you don't have to deal with other people so much, you can be anonymous. I mean, it's all the pieces started to fit. So that's where I went when I went on this trip, and ultimately that's where I found him. And then what preceded was this series of interactions that I had with him that ultimately went on for like weeks and weeks, and that's when I really started to get a closer look at his personality and the complexity that we mentioned earlier, that this was a really interesting person. And he was a really interesting person, very disturbed and troubling, but certainly very interesting.
Um, so you kind of staked him out, and then he came down and you approached him. I mean, what you had to know he's I don't know if he's hiding. I mean, I know he's moving around, but I don't know if he felt like he was hiding because he knew these stories had come out.
Yeah.
You know, he was, and when you spoke with him, he explained right away that he was super concerned, very, he was obviously worried that it was going to catch up with him.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what it seemed like. I could be misreading it, but
yeah, I mean, so at that point, yeah, there've been a lot of stories about him. I'd written about him, other journalists in the States had written about him, in the UK. The FBI by that point had opened an investigation, and they had created what they called a portal, which was essentially a website where they solicited testimonials from victims from around the world who had encountered this guy, and they asked for relevant details. How, when were you scammed? How much money did you lose? Where did you go? What happened? Do you have any emails or supporting documents to help us? And so they had an entire digital infrastructure in place to help build their case, because there were victims from all around the world. I later figured it out. There were every single continent on the planet except Antarctica. There were victims from everywhere. And so, they had the FBI had this digital portal. They were soliciting information. There was an investigation in the UK. This guy had already been had been taken to court by various victims in other scams and in other sort of criminal enterprises that had, for small amounts of money, but still there were lots of people who'd tried to get him in court in the UK already. The Indonesians were the authorities in Indonesia were looking at it. The Americans were looking at it. The Brits were looking at it. So there was a kind of a net that was closing in. COVID was further complicating it, and yeah, here he was. I mean, he was basically on the lam. He was hiding. He wasn't communicating with me or with any other journalists, and he was doing his best to stay hidden, and so it was not a given that an effort to communicate with him in this way was going to be successful. And
right, yeah, he hadn't been answering your call, your messages, so
yeah,
you would assume you show up and he'd be like, get away from me.
yeah, exactly, yeah. And also, by that point, I had been talking to other people, like in his family, people who had known him as a young person, people who had a much, much deeper understanding of his past and who he was and what he was capable of as a person. And I had heard some really disturbing things about things he'd done, behaviors, many of which were just deeply manipulative and criminal. But there were some stories I heard that in which he acted violently. That was troubling for me, as somebody who was going in search of him. I obviously didn't want to get into any kind of situation where I would be in danger or where anybody else around me, even people in the street, potentially would be in danger. So that was a concern. So there were a lot of factors, that went into, or that I had to think about when contemplating this. I didn't want to, and I didn't want him to hurt himself either. He was a subject of an investigation. There were serious people in the FBI and in the United States Department of Justice that wanted to hold him to account. I didn't want to stand in their way. So there was a lot to consider, and ultimately I settled on the idea that I would approach him in a public place, for maximum safety, and also to give everybody involved a chance to extricate themselves with the least possible, repercussions and damage and so forth. So there were a number of reasons for that, and yeah. So then I I ultimately approached him, and he agreed to. I mean, he chatted with me for quite a while there in the street. At first, he was pretty freaked out. He said he didn't want to talk to me, and he started lying about all kinds of stuff right away. He said his lawyers were, you know, he said his lawyers would be in touch with me. He didn't have any lawyers at that time. He said he
Right.
started mentioning all these friends, people that he wanted me to talk to. None of those people existed, as far as I could tell. So there was this kind of barrage, right, of like feints and half truths and outright lies. But then mixed in there was the skeleton of his story. There were things that he said that were true, and people who he mentioned who did exist because I'd spoken to them. So there was a kind of the seed of something real, and of course that drew me in further because I really wanted to understand who he was. And I think this goes back to maybe our mutual interest in these topics is sort of like, well, what are the deeper psychological forces at work, and who are these people? Why do they do what they do? What shaped them? What events in their early life went into making them who they are, who they became? And I really was interested in that. I wasn't just out to kind of get a salacious, crazy story. I was genuinely curious about who this person was and why he did what he did. And so to me, there was like an intrinsic value in having a conversation with him because I thought those answers to be instructive about the nature of what it means to be a human being, which is of endless fascination to me.
Right. How so what was your plan if you didn't contact him?
Yeah,
Like, you've
good
had enough
question.
contact with everybody else, and it
Yeah,
would, like, it's good either way. I was thinking either way, it's good contact, or I'm sorry, good content for the book to explain that, look, I did everything I could. I went over there. This is what happened. I approached him. He said no. He spun me. I never heard from him again. But you've got that 2 or 3 pages in the book, and then you go
yeah,
on with these kind of ancillary kind of
yeah,
people that are surrounding him that can give you some information.
yeah,
But you still have a book to put out.
yeah,
So if you can't talk to him,
yeah.
it's going to be a vastly different book.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, and that was a real, well, that was basically one of the main motivators for going over there to see him. Was I realized at some point I have to talk to this person. I don't it's just I have to try. I have to do my absolute best to talk to this person to understand as much as I can about what happened and why. And yeah, I mean, I don't know how it would have gone if I hadn't talked to him. I had quite a bit of material from other people, but I didn't have his perspective, and it was his perspective that I
Right.
wanted and that I felt I needed to really understand things. And ultimately, I think the the kind of the sort of the big picture takeaway that really was interesting to me that emerged from those conversations that I had with him was kind of a better, bigger, more nuanced understanding about the nature of kind of storytelling. He was somebody who was constantly telling stories. I mean, he told these elaborate stories to his victims to ensnare them, in these really elaborate fantasies and these plots to get them to travel from, Colorado Springs to Jakarta, Indonesia. I mean, thousands and thousands of miles away to pursue these fantastical fake work opportunities. It takes a real skill, not just with impersonation, but with story building, like persuading people that this tale that you're spinning is real and legitimate. and that was his real skill. He had a real talent for storytelling and kind of drawing people into these imaginary worlds. And what I was so kind of compelled by when I started having conversations with him was just the immense sort of descriptive powers that he had, and the imagination that he had, and the sort of ability to pull from all these different strands of myth and movies and books and childhood stories, and this whole universe of stories that he would constantly be sort of swimming in, and he would use all of these things to inform our conversations. And so as a result, we would have these really interesting conversations about Indonesian myth, or the gods and the goddesses, who peopled the ancient the ancient religions of the archipelago, or like I talk about in the book the Thousand and One Nights. He was a huge fan of the Thousand and One Nights, so I wound up reading a lot of the Thousand and One Nights book because he was so well versed in those stories that they informed his understanding of himself, his understanding of the world, and then they also informed the scam. So I guess what I'm saying is that there was this huge kind of sprawling universe of stories that he was totally embedded in, and so the con, such as it was, existed in this kind of larger context of stories. And so I found myself getting drawn into his world of stories. Khan was kind of embedded in these in this whole sort of sprawling universe of stories and myths and half truths and delusions, and movies he'd seen and books he'd read and stories that he'd concocted himself, like literally stories that he'd written, or dreams he'd had. And so the whole thing became a kind of an exercise in trying to figure out, well, which of these stories is real, which is total delusion or fantasy. How do they relate to each other? How do they influence each other? And what does all of that say about the con, but also just about him, and then about at an even more kind of meta level, about this conversation that he and I were having? Like, was this just another story that he was telling? Was he using me? Was he, like, what was going on? And so ultimately that's kind of where I landed at the end of all these conversations, was just feeling like I was in this kind of kaleidoscopic Alice in Wonderland alternate universe, peopled with the characters of his fiction, of his imagination, and his sort of fantastical life. And it was a very strange place to find myself. It was very strange to suddenly to feel like I was inhabiting his imagination in a way. But as a writer, it was great material, because he would just tell me these absolutely wonderful stories about trips he'd taken and people he'd met, and what it meant for him and his development as a person. And I just found all that stuff fascinating.
Well, while this is happening, because at this point you'd gone back to, where were you living then?
Yeah, I was living in Seattle at the time. Yeah.
Okay, so you've gone back to Seattle. You're having these conversations. Is he still running this con? Like, how is he surviving at this point?
Yeah, so I left him in Manchester. I went back to Seattle. As far as I know, he stayed in his apart hotel there, where I had found him originally. And we carried on having these conversations. And over the course of the next several weeks, I had conversations with him, but I was sort of simultaneously through other sources, investigatory sources and law enforcement and this kind of thing, tracking what he was doing, purely for the scam. And one day I learned that, I got a report basically that very day he had, a victim had revealed that he had sent something like a few $1,000s anyway to to the scammer. And what had happened is that he had, ever since COVID started, he'd started tailoring the scam to COVID. So people were paying money for online courses, for instance, like martial arts training, acting classes. There were a whole range of services that people were paying for in a remote capacity and then wiring money overseas to, for the work. And so instead of being crippled by the pandemic in the way that so many people were, he adapted. And so that was happening. Some of it anyway was happening, it appears, while I was talking to him. And I should say, while he was expressing at various points a great deal of remorse, or supposed remorse, for the
Right.
for the things that he had done. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's all of these investigations going on. He's hanging out at this place. He knows you've found him. I'm assuming he knows, that people know where he's at. Like, he has to know this is coming to an end.
Yeah, well, so a few other things happened during the course of our conversation. So one was that around that time, a grand jury in the United States, at the behest of the Department of Justice, had handed down an indictment. So the wheels of justice were spinning, on multiple levels. There was an FBI investigation. The UK was investigating, but now there was also a grand jury indictment, which meant that, things had proceeded to that phase. I mean, it wasn't just in an investigatory phase anymore. There were actual, legal proceedings that were happening. So that was one thing. And then the other thing that happened was that there was a podcast, among the many people who got interested in this story. There was a podcast at one point that had been doing a bit of work on it, and they revealed his name publicly. And that happened while he and I were actually in conversation over the course of these many weeks on these Zoom calls that we were having with him in the UK and I was in Seattle. And during that window of time of several weeks, this podcast revealed his name. And so suddenly he had been, kind of publicly outed. And so I kind of had a front row seat in a way. Well, I did. I had a front row seat to his reaction to being publicly outed, and I got to see the full measure of his rage and his frustration and his desire for vengeance and his absolute fury at being outed. And so interspersed with all the things that I was describing earlier, his kind of rambling storytelling and these very elaborate kind of fantasies that formed his biography, or his autobiography as he was telling it to me. Interspersed with that were these absolutely furious asides where he would just lash out at different people. He would lash out at Nicole, the investigator who had been pursuing him for many years by that point. he lashed out at the folks who did the podcast, who had publicized his name, at victims. He told me that the victims deserved what they got, that they wanted fame, that they were they were just asking for it, and he lashed out at me. I mean, there were many times where he got very angry at me and threatened to stop talking to me, or worse. So I got to see all the different sides of his personality sort of in real time, as he was responding to this world, this law enforcement, but also kind of the public world closing in on him. And it was interesting because, having seen where he lived and what his world was like in Manchester, which was a pretty circumscribed world, he left his apartment. He went to Marks and Spencer to get food. He came back to his apartment. He didn't do a whole lot. And now that world was getting even smaller, and more people were paying attention, and not the people that he wanted to pay attention. So all of that was happening, as I was having the conversation, and ultimately his world got even smaller. It completely shut down because in the middle of our conversations, toward the end of our conversations, he got arrested. So what started as this good faith effort on my part to have a conversation with him was successful, but it was not ended by me nor by him. Our conversations were simply stopped because the police closed in on him and arrested him.
Right. Well, did you ever, I mean, was he arrested to be extradited back to the US, or was this, the UK arresting him?
Yes.
Did he commit crimes in the UK?
Yeah, those are all good questions. So the way it works is, the arrest, as I understand it, the arresting authority has to be the local authority, but there was a request by the FBI to both investigate this person and then to proceed with an arrest for the purpose of extradition back to the United States, which is where he faces charges. So even though there are people who want to pursue him for crimes committed in the UK, the charges that he currently faces are US federal charges. So he would be extra. So he's been in jail for several years now, and that is all related to his extradition case back to the US. About a year ago, a judge in the UK ruled, after a couple years of proceedings, ruled that he should be extradited back to the US. And in his ruling, he cited Harvey's terrible behavior and his long-running scam and a bunch of other stuff. But basically, he ruled in favor of extradition. And then Harvey very quickly set about appealing the decision, and that's where it stands now. So the decision on the appeal has not yet been rendered, but he remains in jail in the US. In the UK.
UK.
Yeah, in the UK, pending extradition to the US on, I believe it's 8 federal charges. Then the other question, of course, is is he gonna cop a plea? Is he gonna fight it? Maybe a judge in the UK might rule time served and cut him loose. All of that remains to be seen.
Yeah, he can't go to trial in the US. Not with, there's a ton of evidence.
Yeah.
Against them, and people will show up.
Yeah.
You don't need a lot to get convicted in the US.
Right. So I guess you'd know about that.
Yeah. But he, and hold And yeah, he's there. There's just so much evidence against him. I mean, they're going to have wire transfers. They're going to have video calls. They're going to have phone calls. They're going to have, like, he can't go to trial. Like, he'll probably, and he's been arrested, and he was in prison in Indonesia, correct?
Yeah, exactly. We haven't even talked about that, but yeah, years ago, years before any of this happened, he was convicted on basically, white collar type crime, embezzlement, something like that. Sent to an Indonesian high security Indonesian prison called Cipinang, and he was set to serve a year or two for these white collar crimes. And then while he was in prison serving time, he made a series of bomb threats against the US Embassy in Jakarta. And then he was convicted. He was caught and convicted on terrorism related charges in Jakarta, and given several additional years on top of his existing white collar crime. And so he spent, a number of years in a prison in Jakarta on these different crimes. And that was all in a previous life prior to any of this stuff having to do with being a food influencer or an impersonator of Hollywood royalty.
Yeah, they're not going to take a bomb threat lightly.
Yeah.
I knew a guy who wrote a letter, who was incarcerated, who wrote a letter to the president and threatened the president, and got 7 years.
Oh, wow.
And the guy was mentally, he wasn't even all there. Like, I don't think he could get himself to DC, let alone close to the president.
Wow.
But doesn't matter. They're not playing around.
Yeah, they don't joke around with that stuff. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So he's. I mean, have you spoken with him since he's been incarcerated?
No, I did go up to the UK and I attended a bunch of his hearings for extradition. He never appeared in court. He always zoomed in remotely from prison, and those were pretty interesting. Yeah, he would rant and rave a bit here and there, but mostly there were just a succession of different witnesses for both sides talking about his mental wellness or lack thereof. There were a number of medical professionals called by his legal team who testified to a variety of personality disorders that they believed he had, and that's all in the court record. There were people, he was trying to make a case that he shouldn't be extradited because if he were sent to the US, he would be subjected to extreme cruelty and torture because he's a gay man. And I guess the argument was that gay people can't be in prison or something, but that doesn't hold.
That's not true.
That doesn't hold water.
I was in prison for 13 years. There were plenty of gay guys, openly gay, and they would, I always make the joke that they ran the place. Like, they get free commissary. There's lots of guys that want to be their friends. They're not harassed. They're not raped.
Right.
They're not, they're just gay.
Yeah.
They got lots of friends. Like, and he wouldn't end up in a prison that would, like, maybe if he went to a penitentiary where there were violent criminals, but he won't.
Right.
He'll go to a low. Even if he gets under 20 years, he's going to go to a low.
Okay.
I spent 9 years in a low.
Okay.
He'll be fine.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
So
yeah,
that's not a, now I could see an argument for, hey, the US is trying to give me 150 years, and then the UK saying 150 years, this is a white collar crime. Like, what are you talking about? Like, that's, cruel and unusual punishment, because I've seen guys that have been extradited from the UK or from Canada, and that's a lot of times their argument, because the U.S. attorneys will come in and say, "Guys, he's facing 400 years," and their attorneys will say, "He's facing a maximum of 5 years here, Your Honor. Do you want to give him a life sentence?" You're basically giving him a life sentence for something that in the UK you can't get a life sentence for.
Mm-hmm.
So then they negotiate. Okay, we
Mm.
promise he won't get more than this much, and then they start dropping it, because that's actually an argument that people have won.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. I can see that happening. I mean, I guess, but that would fall under that would be sort of part of the plea agreement, I guess, right?
Yeah, you can make a negotiation between the UK and the US before you even plea in the US.
I see.
The
I
US
see.
can have an agreement with the UK, like, look, we're going to send him back, but you can't give him 100 years.
I see.
Like, the most he would face here is 5 or 17 years or 12 years. And then they'd say, okay, we promise we won't give him more than 12 years.
I see.
And then they're like, okay, well, now we don't have an argument anymore,
Right. Right.
because the UK, in most places, no, obviously he's not going to get 400 years.
Right.
But, that's what the US does, is they say, he's facing this much time. He's a serious criminal. And they don't realize that most European countries don't look at it like that.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, hey, like, we're not trying to kill this person or have him die in jail. We want him incarcerated and integrated back into society. We're not trying to destroy people here. We're trying to incarcerate them and then make them citizens again. Like,
Right.
in a way, they kind of feel like, hey, we've failed this person. How can we correct his behavior and integrate him back into society? And U.S. prosecutors do not look at it like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
that
right.
a lot of times they'll go in front of a judge in the UK or in, Canada, for the Crown in Canada or for wherever, and they're like used to being in front of a federal judge here, and they're like, yeah, he this and this and this, and it's serious, and they're thinking it's serious. He stole $500,000. I sentenced, someone in Canada is like, the guy stole $500,000. He'll get 3 years at most here.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, he'll do a year and he'll be able to do the next 2 years at home on an ankle monitor and be able to work. Like, you guys are saying you're going to give him 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
So they're like, I'm sorry, I can't send him back there.
Mm-hmm.
I can't let you do that. So, where a federal judge in the United States would say, like, yeah, it's a serious crime, like, because they'll sentence you to 20 years for a white collar crime. They don't do that over there. So that's a lot of time the argument. So then they'll negotiate and say, hey, look, we're going to drop all these charges,
Mm-hmm.
or we promise we won't give him more than the statutory maximum of 10 years. And sometimes they'll be like, that's still stiff, but he did break laws. He did rip a bunch of Americans off. You guys did indict him already. Okay, we'll send him.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I've seen that happen many times. So, and listen, he'll still get way more here than he will get in the UK. And that's why he's terrified. Trust me, he would rather be sentenced in the UK or Canada or Belgium or someplace where they'll put you in a 4-star hotel
Mm-hmm.
and let you work and come and go.
Mm-hmm.
And, like in Norway, it's like
Hmm.
that guy in Norway who executed 80 something children and camp
Mm-hmm.
teachers and stuff at a camp,
Mm-hmm.
got like 23 years. Like, the statutory maximum they could give him was like 23 years or something.
Yeah.
He killed like 80 people.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And he's staying in essentially like a nice little hotel
Right.
on an island,
Right.
where he gets to take classes and work a little job. It's like,
Yeah.
this is insane. You've gotten the death penalty in the United States.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
so so trust me, he wants to stay in the UK.
I believe you, and I think you're right. He's already been there for 3.5 years now. So I actually do wonder. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the judge is going to say on this appeal, but I wonder if there's a possibility they might just say, well, okay, you've done your time. You can go.
Right.
I don't know.
So what? So why haven't you tried to contact him or spoken with him? And what happened with the book? Like, how does that end? What do you do at this point?
Well, I mean, the book came out last June, and and I kind of ended it where the documentary ended, which is, I went to Indonesia on this trip, and I tracked down everybody that I could in his entourage, or people that knew him, and there was one guy who was a driver who he worked with pretty closely, and I tracked that guy down. And so I just, I ended the book where the story ended at the time, which was with him in prison, having been arrested after having all these conversations, and his fate, uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen. So that's where the book ends. Encourage everyone to read it. But yeah, it's called The Hollywood Con Queen, just like the doc. Yeah, and I'll give you the links and stuff and all that. But yeah, it's called The Hollywood Con Queen, and actually the paperback came out the day that the doc was released. So the hardback came out last year, and the paperback just came out last month.
Okay.
Yeah, and anyway, so that's where the book ends. And in terms of my kind of contact with him, I did initially reach out to his attorney in the UK, and I said, hey, I'd love to talk to Harvey again, and I'm here, if he wants to talk. I tried a few times. I don't know, I probably sent half a dozen emails, maybe, just making a bit of an effort to let him know that I was here and I'd love to talk to him. And I never heard back. I mean, I heard back from the lawyer, but I never heard any kind of positive response from Harvey. And then that was it. And honestly, I spent a long time on the story, long time on the book, long time on the doc. And I kind of feel like I'm sort of ready to move on to something else. I spent a lot of time with this guy.
Right.
So,
well,
yeah.
so I have another question,
Yeah.
which is maybe unrelated. How did you end up you're living in France?
Yeah. I live here with my family. Yeah. So your question is, how did I wind up here?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, in a former life, I was a foreign correspondent for a long time, and I started my career in France. I started at Newsweek magazine back when, in the golden days, golden era of magazines and journalism, when Newsweek was, a thing, a reputable place. If you got your face on the cover of Newsweek, it was a big deal, right? And so I worked at Newsweek for many years. I started at Newsweek in Paris in the late 90s. And I went on, and I had a long career at Newsweek as a foreign correspondent, and I worked all over the world, and I worked in a lot of war zones, and worked in Afghanistan and Iraq and Africa and Latin America, all over. But I started here. I also studied in France when I was a student in college. So I always kind of had this soft spot for France. And then, with my family, with my wife, we had always kind of had this idea that we wanted to come back and live in France and raise our kids and have them learn the language and stuff. So we just moved back here a few years ago. And yeah.
Okay. And what are you doing now for work? Are you still writing for?
I'm just writing. I just finished another book, and I'm working on just seeing. I'm just editing it and working on what I can do with that book. That'll be my third book, and then I just finished the doc, and so now I'm casting around for new ideas. I might start a podcast, a Substack, and a podcast. I've got a couple of ideas for another nonfiction book idea. But yeah, I'm open to suggestions. So if you have ideas for great stories, let me know.
Yeah, I interview like 4. It's probably one law enforcement or a writer or director or producer, and then probably 3 probably it's about 75% former criminal, and then 25% a mixture of producers, writers.
Yeah.
That's maybe it's more like closer to 90% criminals. I don't know. Well, sometimes
Yeah.
it's just somebody. I had a guy that came on and told a whole story about his father who had tried to scam the Bill Gates senior out of a few $1,000,000. But I mean, it just came out like yesterday, and he wasn't even involved. It's just he was there when his dad was doing all of these things, and it was about his upbringing and his father and how he was kind of like a con man. And
Yeah.
but it was interesting. We talked for like over 2 hours. It was really very interesting. He told the story great. So
So I've got
so sometimes it's not like
I
that.
got a question for you though. As someone who has spent time in prison, and as someone who talks to a lot of criminals, two questions. One, what did you think of this particular scam or this criminal? And then also, I'm kind of curious, like what have you, like, are there commonalities, or sort of what are the common themes, I guess, that you have come to understand about the lives and personalities of the criminals that you interview? I mean, that's got to be really interesting. Like,
Um, I would say most criminals, obviously they have, 90% of them are, antisocial disorder. They're, sociopaths, psychopaths, narcissists. I'd say most of them, almost all of them, have entitlement issues. They just feel that they're owed something because I'm Matt Cox.
mm-hmm,
I'm owed this. What I'm
mm-hmm,
saying? So it's super, like, just real personality defects. I mean, no concern about, like, the idea that this guy would have done all this and was concerned and felt horrible for his victims. No, you don't. Stop it. That's not true. You may know. Listen, I know what's appropriate to say.
mm-hmm,
I can tell you, I can say all the right things, but that's not, I'd say it if I needed to. That's not one of them.
mm-hmm,
You see what I'm saying? Like, I've never laid awake at night and been concerned about a victim.
mm-hmm,
Now, I certainly didn't do any of the things that he did. I focused on financial institutions, but that's not to say that periodically I didn't call somebody to have to go out and hire an attorney to fix something that I had done because I stole their identity, or I encumbered the title to their home or something like that, and they had to go hire an attorney, and it cost them $5,000 or $10,000. Like, I certainly did that, and I could easily justify that at the time, looking back and seeing what really occurred.
mm-hmm,
I'm like, wow, that wasn't my intention. But the truth is, I'm smart enough. I should have known that was what was going to happen. But in the moment, you can justify it to yourself so you can sleep like a baby at night and move on with your day without feeling like, oh, I'm a jerk. Everybody wants to think they're a nice guy. I'll bet you Harvey thinks he's a wonderful human being, and all of this is just happening to him out of the blue, and he didn't even deserve this.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Wasn't even a big deal. Those people got a nice vacation, and did they pay for it? Of course they paid for it. They had the vacation.
mm-hmm,
You know what I'm saying? Like, he's justifying these things to himself.
mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm,
yeah, I would say, that's that. And I'd say that not all, but probably 95% of these guys have had horrific upbringings.
mm-hmm,
But then again, who can't look back on their, on their upbringing and pinpoint one or two key moments that were horrific. And then what do? They suck it up. They rub some dirt in it. They graduate high school and college, and they get a job, and they raise a family. They don't go out and rob 16 banks.
mm-hmm,
So those aren't really fair.
mm-hmm,
Is it a commonality? Yes, but it's not fair.
mm-hmm.
It's not fair to say, oh, well, that makes sense. Well, I think there's a lot of contributing, but overall, I think it's just in general, I think it's just something that's ingrained in you.
Like, you're born with, yeah.
Yeah. And then maybe some things put you in those situations, and you run with it, or maybe everything goes well and you become an actor or
Mm-hmm.
a businessman, and you never end up having to act on those behavior, those personality traits never take hold, and you never have to utilize them to commit a crime. Just so happens you open a waterbed warehouse location, and before you know it, you have 2 and 3 and 4, and you have 400 employees, and you're making great money, and there was never a time that you needed to commit fraud to succeed. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, had you probably would have. You just didn't. So,
Yeah.
that's my, so unfortunately, there is no 100% specific commonality.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's situational.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
eh.
And in your case, have all these conversations that you've had with other criminals in your own time, has it led to insight about your own trajectory and your own path?
Yeah, what really happened for me was when I wrote a memoir. And really, I read a book. I read several books, but there was one book in particular that I had read, and the worst part is I can't even remember the name of it. And it was the shortest book I read too, on how to write memoirs, by a woman who'd written 2 memoirs. Like, apparently she thought a lot of herself. But I read this little, like, 90-page book, and it was just great. And she said so many great things in it. And one of the things she said was that you needed to look for things that helped shape your personality, or could kind of help predict the things that you did in the future, throughout this journey. And she said, and be able to bring that to the attention of the reader, whether it was true or not, whether you believed it was true or not. And at that point, I started looking at things that I just brushed off. Well, yeah, that happened, and people have said that probably had an effect, but it didn't have any effect on me. That didn't have any effect on me. But then you start focusing, and you do that introspective, work on yourself, and you really look at yourself, and you start going, yeah, that probably wasn't normal behavior. Yeah, that's not a normal thing that my father did. Or, yeah, not everybody does grow up with an alcoholic father that is, verbally abusive, and, some people do. They're super successful. They never break the law. But for me, it probably helped contribute, So you start looking at those things. So I did that when I was writing my memoir in prison. And then, of course, you're aware of it, and you start focusing on it. And so every time I talk to people, I'm always curious, like, well, how were you raised? Did you have both parents? Like, what'd they do? And I'm just to kind of see, did that contribute? Could you at least make the argument that contributed? Like, and in many ways you can. I mean, so your mom was, had 5 kids from 5 different baby daddies. Your personal father was in and out of prison, or you never knew him. All your brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles were selling drugs. They were in and out of prison. You were raised next to the projects. Your mother was almost never home. And gee, guess what? You ended up selling drugs and going to jail. That's crazy. How did that happen? You know what I'm saying? Like, of course that happened. Like, everybody that's surviving and making decent money is selling drugs.
Yeah. Yeah.
So of course, not everybody does. Some people look at it and say, oh, I'm not doing that. But some people don't. Some people say, no, I can do that. I'm going to make it work. Or if I go to jail, I go to jail. Like, my life is so miserable to begin with. Like, yeah, so I'll have to go to jail. That's fine. So yeah, I wish there was something really definitive, but there's just no one thing. And I tell you what, though, talking to people now and hearing their stories and looking at them and where they are now, and talking to my wife and there are so many signs that it's like, what was I thinking? And I do this all the time when these guys are talking. They're like, so this happened. I'm like, what were you thinking? Why didn't you? Well, I need the money. Why didn't you get another job? Why didn't you do this? And, I love the guys that do the, I needed to, I wanted to be a man and be able to provide for my family, and then get another job, then get 2 jobs, then get, you know what I'm saying? Like that. Why wasn't that the option? That's what a man does. He gets 2 jobs, but that's not how they think, and that's not what happened. But you can see it. But as they're talking, you can already see it unfolding.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Just sort of justifying their bad behavior.
yeah.
Do you think that
But
you mentioned like verbal abuse? Um, can you elaborate on that at all? Or I mean, you don't have to. I'm just curious. Like what?
no, it's fun. Listen, I'm like an open book. Like, it's virtually impossible to embarrass me or get me,
Mm-hmm.
um, um, I would say just, my father was just an alcoholic. He would get drunk. And the worst thing about it was when he was sober, he was a great guy. He was semi belligerent sometimes, kind of a bully. But when he was drunk, he was a complete bully. And he'd yell at you. He'd call my sisters whores and tell them they were never going to be anything. And, that I was stupid and I was never going to be anything. And, and I was a little kid. You're 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 years old, and I'm struggling with dyslexia. I'm going to special schools. Like, I already think I'm stupid. Like, I don't need your affirmation. Like I'm good with my own opinion. I'm seeing what's happening already. I'm not passing school very well. I'm not doing very well. I don't need you to help, make me feel even worse. And then he was belligerent to my mother and, calling her names, and she was a saint.
Mm-hmm.
The worst thing my mother ever did was she was an enabler, but
Mm-hmm.
she's also trying to protect the guy who's providing the income that's keeping all of us in a nice home, driving decent vehicles. And my father made good money. We were definitely upper middle class. Like, we all had cars.
Mm-hmm.
We're living in a nice house. We're living in, off the golf course. It's close to the golf course, next to the Hillsborough River. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we're members of the country club. I mean, it's a nice life.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, you hear those things enough and you start to believe them, and you start to wonder, how am I going to survive when I get older? So,
Yeah.
So when things start failing, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
I'm willing to do whatever it takes not to have to move into this guy's house.
Right.
When I graduate college, I get, start becoming a mortgage broker. And when it comes time that I've got a loan that is almost ready to close, but there's one thing wrong, and if you just fix that one thing, you'll get a check. I'm ready to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
I have to make this work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, not that it's his fault. I mean, obviously I could have done the right. I could have stepped backwards and moved into my old spare room and said, I'm just going to stay here until I can make this work. But that wasn't the road I traveled.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and then it just spiraled out of control,
Mm-hmm.
Then I, just because the more things work, the more brazen, you get, the more brazen I got. And, every time I got away with something, it emboldened me, and then you make money on it, and before you know it, you start feeling good about yourself. And I start feeling good about myself, and I started thinking I was just great at this. I was amazing at this, and this is what I should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm good at it. I'm making tons of money. They're not catching me. I'm amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Self-fulfilling cycle. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Super optimistic.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so, but I do, the one thing, it's funny, the one thing I love doing is the interviews.
Yeah.
Like, I was talking to a guy another podcaster recently. He's like, man, you're doing like 4 a week? Because that must be exhausting. Listen, that's the only part of this job I like.
Mm-hmm.
The scheduling, having to talk to people on the phone and schedule, hear the, is there enough here for a podcast? Is it interesting enough to hold my viewers' attention? Like, having to kind of weave a story sometimes when people get off on a tangent, and you got to remember to pull them back. Like, all of those are things that, like, I enjoy that part of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's the finding people, scheduling, making sure they show up, making sure they're in the right spot and everything looks as good as it can look.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That kind of stuff. Like, that's a pain in the ass. But actually, when we start talking, like, it's one of the few times that I actually don't want to talk about myself. Like, my narcissism doesn't tend to take over. I get to sit there and do this. And then what happens?
Well, you like the stories, right? It's the thing.
I love the stories.
Yeah.
I love the stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, who doesn't love stories? Like
Well, that's it.
that,
Yeah.
I always tell these guys, I'm not doing anything now that I didn't do for 13 years sitting in the rec yard in a prison.
Yeah.
The only difference is there's a camera now and YouTube mails me a check at the end of the month.
Right. Right.
Like, how cool is that?
Right. Right.
This is the coolest job ever.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. I mean, yeah, good for you, man. You've really cornered a little market here. It's cool.
Yeah, I didn't even know this was a thing. Like when I got out of prison, I didn't even know how I was going to make a living. I'd written a bunch of true crime stories when I was locked up, gotten some books published, got out, had a bunch of synopses, but I still was thinking, you're going to work at McDonald's, you're going to live in someone's spare room, and you're going to be appreciative, and you're going to keep your head down, and you're going to just ride the rest of your life out doing this. That's it. That's your life. And then I got out, and there was this whole YouTube thing, and I thought, probably look into that. This might be something. And everybody kept saying, you got to do this. You got to do this. I was like, well, you guys can use your iPhone and I can't use mine. You're clearly smarter than me. I can barely figure out the technology that's developed over the last 13 years. So maybe I ought to pay attention and start looking into it. And so I did, and it's doing great. Got a few great people to help me along the way. I was just blessed to have people that just, everything fell into place. Like, very, very lucky. Could have gone bad. I could still be in that spare room.
How long have you been doing the interviews?
I want to say 4 years now. It's got to be close to 4 years. It definitely, you know what? It's definitely 4 years. Now that I think it must be I must be right at the cusp of 4 years. I'm doing the math of when I moved into my first apartment. Did it for about 6 months when I was living this rooming house for 6 months. It was just me talking to the camera. Then I started I got a 1-bedroom apartment, started it there, lived there for a year, and then I moved into the place I'm at right now, and I've been doing it here since then. So it's got to be 4 years. Yeah, 4 years.
And
4 years, and it pays all my bills.
Wow. Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, good for you.
Yeah. I mean, I do this, I do keynote speeches where the same banks that I used to rip off fly me in, have me talk for 45 minutes to an hour, and then fly me back out, and they pay me for it. So that's amazing. I do that. I do podcasts. I'm trying to get several documentaries made right now. I've signed some agreements with several production companies. Been to Los Angeles a few times in the last few months. And I also do stuff for Home Title Lock, which is a company that provides a service that watches people's titles so they can't get scammed by people like me. So I do stuff for them. So yeah. It's a brave new world.
Yeah. Well, congratulations. I mean, that's a success story. That's cool.
We'll see. I want to have a documentary like yours. Like I want someone to take one of my books and turn it into a documentary.
Yeah. Well. Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
Well, I mean, do you feel good? How do you feel about all this? Do you feel like, is there anything else you want to cover, or?
I mean,
buy the book.
Yeah.
Watch the documentary.
Buy the book.
We got that down.
Yeah. Buy the book. Watch the documentary. Follow me on Instagram, Scott Cameron Johnson. So there's 2 books actually. Buy the books. There's The Wolf and the Watchman, and that is the story of my life with my father, who was a CIA case officer for 30 years.
Right.
And that's on Amazon, available wherever you buy books. And then the second book is The Hollywood Con Queen, also available wherever you get your books. And then the doc, also by the same name, The Hollywood Con Queen, available Apple TV.
You guys, I really appreciate you watching. Do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you get notified. Also, I'm in the description. We're going to leave all of Scott's links, like to his Instagram, to both of his true crime books, also to, well, I'm not sure they're true crime, nonfiction books, and to the documentary. I watched the documentary. I thought it was great. Can't say I've read his book, but it was based off of his book. It's a great doc, super interesting, and really appreciate you guys watching. Please leave me a comment and consider joining my Patreon. I really do appreciate you guys watching. Thank you very much. See ya.